Today's guest is Miles Jennings, the head of policy and general counsel for a16z Crypto, the digital assets arm of venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz. A16z has over $74 billion in total regulatory assets under management and more than $7.6 billion specifically committed to crypto investments. Miles' job is to advise the firm and those crypto portfolio companies on decentralization, DAOs, governance, NFTs, as well as the securities laws surrounding them. We're excited to have him on the show today. Miles, welcome.
Thanks. Really happy to be here and excited to discuss.
Yeah, for sure. To start off, can you kind of tell us, what does crypto in America mean to you?
Yeah, so to me, I think, crypto in America really, crypto is about the continuation of the American experiment. I think that, the technology itself enables, safeguarding of individual liberties and freedoms, and also promotes, competition and entrepreneurship. I think, in a world that is becoming increasingly more centralized, right? More of our internet traffic is going through just a few companies. More of our cars or driving is going through just a few companies. More of our banking services are through just a few companies, right? And that increasing centralization presents a risk and gives a lot of power to entrenched interests. And so crypto is about kind of opening that back up and giving entrepreneurs the ability to build new, services and move us away from those entrenched interests. But crypto is not a monolith, just like America, and it's not perfect. And there are kind of sectors of the industry that are, extractive. And so I think we need, solid regulation to basically, harness the good and hopefully dispel the bad.
Miles, you've recently stepped into an expanded role at a16z, taking over policy leadership from Brian Quintenz as he gears up for his Senate confirmation to lead the CFTC. How has that shift changed your day-to-day responsibilities, especially on top of your responsibilities as a general counsel already? Like, what does your day look like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would like to say that I got to get rid of some of the work that I was previously doing, but that hasn't been the case so far. So, I mean, I would say that for most of my time at Andreessen so far, I've been focused on helping our entrepreneurs navigate a lot of the regulatory uncertainty. Fortunately, right now, some of the pressure in that environment has been released by the fact that the SEC is now engaged in kind of a constructive relationship with the industry, as opposed to one that is very hostile and outright just trying to destroy it. So as a result of that, I think that there's been a little bit more time now to focus on the policy. We have an incredible opportunity here to write the rules of the road that are going to hopefully move the industry in a positive direction going forward. And so that's the most important thing right now.
Yeah. So Miles, I'm really curious, as somebody who is also kind of sitting in the GC seat, but obviously on the layer one side of things, last administration, it was really, really challenging to give that kind of day-to-day regulatory advice, to founders. And, obviously I just have one set of founders. You have a huge portfolio of companies you guys are working with. Have you seen kind of any Optimism, or, obviously you guys put out a lot of incredibly useful content that we'll get into, around that regulatory clarity, but what has just been the shift in how you're able to talk to those founders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a much more optimistic view of the world, right? In under the prior administration, you had to be giving, guidance and kind of helping companies think through all of the downside scenarios, right? Whereas now I think you can help them look at what are the opportunities in front of us. And I think that, a constructive relationship with the SEC really opens up the opportunity for entrepreneurs focusing on the things that are going to benefit, the industry the most, benefit their companies the most, and benefit consumers the most, right? As opposed to doing things that were, that didn't make a lot of sense. One of the things we joke about or talk about internally, right, is that, a lot of the industry has been slowed down by the fact that you basically had lawyers designing the products that were coming to market. And, I'm a lawyer, but that is not a very good, way to make sure that an industry is actually meeting consumer needs.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask you, given that you are a16z, is kind of how do you think about this new incentivization of American crypto innovation kind of change the way you talk to portcos, and how else do you kind of see the American market expanding with crypto? With that in mind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that it's an incredible opportunity right now. I think one of the, if you look at the regulatory framework and situation that we were in under the previous administration, right, there were a lot of perverse incentives that were created. The SEC's 2019 framework, right, incentivized entrepreneurs to abandon their projects in order to not, be subject to securities laws. They also incentivized people to move offshore. And so you have a lot of American-built projects, right, moving, intellectual property and personnel outside the United States, right? And I post about this day, even not doing airdrops in the United States and avoiding U.S. persons. So all of these perverse incentives really were detrimental to U.S. consumers, right, and led to a very opaque market and one that Americans were largely excluded from. And so I think that as we look to the future, right, I think regulatory certainty in the United States can provide one way to really incentivize entrepreneurs to build here. But then we also need to figure out, how do we bring the entrepreneurs that have left back, right? And how do we bring those assets that have been moved offshore, quite justifiably in light of the regulatory uncertainty, how do we get them back in the United States? And I think that should be a key focus of policymakers.
Miles, you've written extensively about the need for clearly defining decentralization as it pertains to tokens. And you just mentioned the 2019 guidance put out by the SEC. Part of that was a speech that was given by your colleague, Bill Hinman, in 2018 that kind of put an emphasis on the token security status being about more decentralization as opposed to the way in which it was packaged and sold. And then this past weekend, we saw Acting Chair Ueda put out a staff directive saying, guys, can you review this and make sure it still aligns with the broader views of the commission? Do you think that the commission will be moving away from that kind of position where defining a token is based on decentralization? Can you kind of elaborate? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I think first off, I will say that Bill is I've known Bill for several years now. It's been one of the great honors of my career to be able to work closely with him. He's, there's few lawyers in this space understand the technology and the legal space around securities laws as well as he does. What I would say is, if you go back to 2019, right, I think we knew a lot less about what this technology was going to be at that time, and I think at that time, the framework that he came up with was actually quite productive in trying to move the industry in the right direction. The problem is that it was largely abandoned by the Biden administration. And then on top of that, right, left to its own devices, we really started to see the perverse incentives that came out of that decentralization framework, which was namely, right, that decentralization doesn't happen at the outset of a project, and it didn't really provide any pathway for progressive decentralization. That's core to entrepreneurs being to build things over the long term. But more importantly, right, that framework, as I said earlier, right, disincentivized entrepreneurs from building. And that should never be something that we're trying to do in a technology sector, right? We should be doing the exact opposite of that. So I really welcome the SEC trying to move away from that framework. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a place for decentralization going forward. One of the things that I've been writing a lot about recently is that, rather than them looking to ongoing efforts and having some very subjective determination of a decentralization, 40 factors that requires the SEC to, look at whether or not, college blockchain clubs are conspiring with founders, which, the resources required for that is just absurd, right? As opposed to that, we should be looking at what is the core kind of technological feature of these systems that differentiates them from ordinary companies. And what we would argue is that it's the fact that they can operate without human intervention and control, right? That they can be, function purely autonomously, permissionlessly, all of these great things that really reduce the risk to users. And so if we define decentralization in that way, right, then we can really move away from this subjective interpretation and really focus on objective criteria. And that's really important because it makes it easier to apply regulatory principles to it. But then it also allows for entrepreneurs to more clearly understand what they can do. And the best part is, right, they don't have to abandon their projects. They actually get to keep working on it. So, we welcome the SEC kind of revisiting the 2019 framework, but we really hope that they, continue to focus on decentralization, but maybe just reframe it in a way that's actually a lot more productive for the space.
Yeah. So Miles, I think obviously share that view that, I was one of these people when we were talking about DAOs in, 2021, back in the good old days. DAOs, it was a bit of a misnomer because these things just don't pop up out of the ground, right?
That's right.
So it feels like, we're getting a bit more to kind of common sense approach. You just mentioned that, you guys at a16z were one of the really early sort of responders to go out and work with the SEC Crypto Task Force and supply that response around this what's become kind of the control framework in the industry. Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit more about, like, was that this culmination of the last few years that we've talked about, or how did you guys decide that was really what needed to be done, and that was the kind of clarity you guys were looking for?
Yeah, well, I would love to take credit as though it was some very novel interpretation, right? But I think if you look at the SEC's 2019 framework and you look at Hester Peirce's Safe Harbor, right? She talks a lot about control in that thing, right? I think what happened is really in 2019 the SEC, right, tried to use decentralization as a single purpose tool, and what that means is it tried to use decentralization to eliminate all potential information asymmetries that could arise from a token. And that meant, right, defining decentralization in a way that turned a digital asset into a pure commodity, right? Something like gold or a diamond. And that was an okay attempt, right? But in retrospect, right, we've seen that it doesn't really work very well. So if you just jettison the part about ongoing efforts, right, which again, I don't think we want to disincentivize entrepreneurs from building, right, then you're left with the control piece. Now, that obviously would, if you just left that on its own, right, would result in potential information asymmetries because entrepreneurs would be continuing to engage in ongoing efforts. But when you do eliminate control, those ongoing efforts are less important, right? And not dissimilar from what we see in commodities markets. There are, a number of different companies that are involved in kind of production of oil, right? We don't regulate oil as a security. So as a result of that, right, we can justifiably say, hey, look, maybe we don't need to go all this way to eliminating ongoing efforts. Maybe that's not a good goal. Let's just eliminate the control, and then we can use disclosure, right, to basically cover the rest of the potential information asymmetries, but we can use a lower threshold, lower regulatory burden of disclosure as compared to securities laws, right, in order to kind of close that gap. And I think ultimately what that really means is what we're talking about is that digital assets kind of function like a hybrid of securities and commodities, as opposed to being either a security or commodity. There's Bitcoin, which is, clearly a commodity, right? But then there are other assets where there are entrepreneurs still, engaging in valuable efforts. We don't want to dissuade them from doing so, nor do we want to subject them to securities laws, because if we set that threshold, then there's no incentive for them to give up control, and we'll just end up with controlled networks the same way that we have, in Web 2. So I think there's a nice medium approach there, right? A pragmatic, like, middle ground that I think is quite workable, and hopefully there's people that agree.
If you've been in the space for a while, you know that crypto is not going anywhere. Governments are talking about Bitcoin reserves, traditional finance is moving on-chain, and if we're building for the long term, we need tech that's fast, reliable, and ready for everyday use. That's where our sponsor, Avalanche, comes in. It's a super fast blockchain network designed for builders, degens, businesses, and institutions. That's why JP Morgan, Citibank, BlackRock, Deloitte, Off the Grid, Sports Illustrated, and more are already using Avalanche. Want to learn more? Join us at the upcoming Avalanche Summit in London on May 20th through the 22nd. Hear directly from leading voices in the Avalanche ecosystem and learn more about the blockchain network driving Web3 adoption. Secure your ticket at avalanchesummitlondon.com. See you there.
Yeah, Miles, you mentioned the sort of natural progression, that led you guys to kind of this conclusion, or at least this set of suggestions, right? And I think one of the other things that is very hard to build in this industry is consensus. So you guys were very early putting this together, but definitely not alone in putting thoughts forward. And one of the fascinating things about, crypto from a legal perspective to me is that this is one of the only spaces where we can really do that, right? We can actually have academic and real impact discussions about where we're going to end up on the future of these laws that affect our industry. With that in mind, what has it been like for you to see and occasionally get into disputes or disagreements, like, with other proponents of other frameworks? Like, how do we all kind of make progress, but sort of get along if we can? Or what has that environment been like for you guys?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a lot of credible views out there, right? And I think that a lot of us want the same things, right? I think no one wants to see this space, be full of get-rich-quick schemes and scams, right? And at the same time, I think most people do not want to rewrite securities laws and have Apple's stock token that is trading outside of the bounds of securities laws, right? So I think there's broad consensus on that, and we can focus on kind of what we agree with. Now, what is the best pathway to get there? Right. I think that there are two extremes, right? There's one side says, hey, let's open up the doors on securities laws. And as long as you don't meet, formalistic requirements, as long as it's, not an actual share, then we don't need to treat it like a security. And I personally think that that's much too loose of a framework. I think any framework really that can't distinguish between, Bitcoin on the one hand or something like FTX's exchange token, I think really kind of creates too loose of a framework that ultimately subjects investors to a lot of risk. On the other side of things, right, you have a similar formalistic approach where you say, hey, let's just treat all of these as securities because they're investments. Well, that's not very workable either, right? I mean, we don't regulate Nike shoes as securities because people invest in them. We don't regulate houses as securities because people are investing in them, right? So I think that's the wrong approach too. And so, in the middle, right, is the substance. And I think, there's broad consensus that we do have to kind of take a principles-based approach that looks at consensus. Now, there's going to be, varying degrees because this technology is so malleable and can be designed in a million different ways, right? There's going to be different degrees of what actually means relinquishing control. Right. But I think that's kind of why we need a principles-based framework with good rules-based safe harbors associated with it. And I can talk about that more if helpful. But I think ultimately, right, we have to give entrepreneurs a clear pathway, but we also have to give regulators a little bit of flexibility, right, to look at where the risk is. And if we try and get overly prescriptive or not prescriptive enough, right, we risk failure on both sides. And so we'd like to see the pendulum stop somewhere in the middle.
I was reading your token classification writings, Miles, and I thought that was very interesting. That you think that there's token taxonomy, that there's 7 different types of tokens in your view that digital assets today fall under. I'm curious to know, have you guys talked to the SEC about this kind of token classification, token taxonomy? What's their view on this? Do you feel like they're maybe going to get on board with classifying it in a similar way that you guys at a16z have?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the real opportunities and like advantages that I have here is I've gotten to work with, a lot of different people, as compared to when I was at Latham and Watkins, right, where I was mostly just working with lawyers and the entrepreneurs I was working for, right? We have a number of engineers here. We have a bunch of researchers. We have Harvard economists, right? And so as a result of that, it allows you to kind of learn a lot from them and then try and cultivate those. So that article that you're talking about was really the culmination of work that I was doing with Scott Commoners and Eddie Lazarin, who's our CTO. Scott Commoners is one of our researchers. And, I think that the way that we kind of delineated between the different token types also kind of speaks back to the control-based decentralization framework that Gerald and I were just talking about. So I think that it's one idea about how you can put these. If you wanted to get really into the weeds, there's probably a million different token types. I think that those 7 broad categories are ones that we're quite focused on. It's the ones that we really talk to entrepreneurs the most about when they're building. And I think that the key, categorization there, right, and the distinction is between company-backed tokens and network tokens, right? And company-backed tokens are things like FTT, FTX's token, where there's really no possibility of relinquishing control or giving up, of achieving decentralization, right? Whereas, network tokens are things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, right? Where there really is the possibility of decentralization, where there isn't, a single person that's controlling the system.
What would you classify XRP as?
I think XRP is a network token, no doubt. Right. I think that at the end of the day, if you look at the kind of the way that we talked about the kind of distinction between a company-backed token and a network token, right? I think there were like 3 questions we looked at. Is the network open, which I think is obviously true for XRP. Is the, do the network effects accrue to token holders? I think that's true. And then, are the economics of the system embedded in it? And I think that is undeniably true as well, right? Demand for XRP stimulates the growth of that ecosystem. So I think that it pretty clearly falls within the definition of network token. Now, I think the distinction, right, is that like network tokens, right, are on a spectrum of decentralization as opposed to, right, they don't necessarily all have to be decentralized versus all centralized, right? There is a spectrum between the two. But as long as you're on that pathway, that is much different, right, than something like FTT, where, that token just related to FTX's centralized exchange. FTX would take its profits from running the exchange and buy back the token to prop up the price. There's no network there, right? The network is FTX.
You also talked a lot about safe harbors before, and I want to give you the opportunity to talk about it more because I know you've submitted a few letters to the SEC regarding this and incentive-based rewards, airdrops, and NFTs. What made you hone in on safe harbors and specifically for those three categories?
So I think that the SEC is obviously, very interested in trying to remove as much regulatory uncertainty as they can. And I think that that's great. Obviously, it's completely night and day compared to what we had during the last administration. But one of the things that we have to be cognizant of, and I think that they are, right, is where the limits of their regulatory authority is, right? And I think that makes it very difficult for them currently to make broad sweeping changes to the way that the industry is regulated, right? If they were to draw a line, in the sand that said all these things are securities and all of these things aren't, well, they don't really have the authority to do that, right? They can say that that's what their opinion is, but the courts might say something different. State securities regulators, plaintiffs' lawyers all might have a very different view. So the level of kind of change or impact that the SEC can make is somewhat constrained in that regard. On the other hand, right, I think that there are a great number of actions that they can take, right, to remove regulatory uncertainty in more narrow fields. So I think what they did about meme coins is great. I think what they did about the stable coins is great. And that's kind of what we were trying to do with the two safe harbors we proposed with respect to airdrops and NFTs. I think those are both areas, right, where they do have the legal authority to essentially create safe harbors to provide more clarity to entrepreneurs and artists.
Mm-hmm. And maybe for the listeners who don't know what a safe harbor is, can you kind of explain briefly what that is?
A safe harbor, basically just says it's not saying, hey, we have authority over this whole area right here. It's essentially the SEC saying, look, if it meets this criteria, then we're not interested in it as a securities transaction. If you don't meet that criteria, that doesn't mean you're automatically a security, right? Or that was a securities transaction. It's essentially just saying, like, similar to what they did with meme coins, which is to say, look, if you meet these criteria, then it's very likely that you're not a security, and as a result, you're not going to be on their priority list of kind of investigatory targets.
Yeah, I think that approach makes a lot of sense. I think it would be remiss, if we, as a Build in America podcast, didn't talk to you a little bit about some of the efforts, that you've been putting together there. Obviously, we had a brief discussion about this at the Decentralized Research Summit. I've talked to David, who's a good friend, about the work you guys are doing on DUNA. It's a very interesting structure that you guys have put forward. And we know that the administration and the regulatory clarity are going to come. But there seems to also be a lot of debate. Would love to ask about the efforts that, we've made that you and I also briefly discussed on. But what is a DUNA? And just for the audience, like, what was developing that framework like for you guys in the effort of giving founders a path, to build here in the States?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that there is a lot of regulatory uncertainty, right, around DAOs and around token holders. There are multiple class action lawsuits out there that seek to, I think, opportunistically, right, go after pockets of money, on very odd theories of potential liability. And given all that regulatory uncertainty, right, plaintiffs' lawyers are really just making investments to try and yield a return on class action lawsuit settlements. That's a huge problem for entrepreneurs. It's a huge problem for investors. And as a result, it really does threaten the space. So, one of the things that we tried to do, and we're proponents of decentralized governance. Obviously, it has to be measured and you can't depend on them for everything. But if we want to empower decentralization, it's almost impossible to eliminate decentralized governance. So how do we safeguard, right, that kind of governance from being subjected to, endless lawsuits from plaintiffs' lawyers? So one of the things that we've tried to do is figure out, okay, is there a way to, use legal entity structures, right, to provide that liability protection? The Decentralized Unincorporated Nonprofit Association that Wyoming passed is one effort to do that. It's a legal entity structure that was based off of, a legal structure that's been adopted in 30 states called the Unincorporated Nonprofit Association. And, the Wyoming's version really is set up to basically function exactly how DAOs function, which is that it, enables token-based governance, and really allows the organization itself to function as the way the DAO does. Now, very key things about it, right? It doesn't have like real, substance of boots on the ground. So you're not going to put, 20 employees into a DUNA, right? It's really about on-chain governance. And so the DUNA functions however the DAO functions. You'll have like one real world administrator that might deal with bank accounts, paying taxes, things like that. But it provides a real path for these things to exist in the United States and actually, bridge the real world to the digital. And then the other kind of key point that people often ask a lot about is the nonprofit designation. Now, that doesn't mean, right, that it is a tax exempt entity. That is not what the nonprofit designation means in that context. It just means, right, essentially that you are restricted from being able to distribute profits to token holders on a pro rata basis. You can compensate them, do a number of different things, but ultimately you're able to engage in for-profit activity just like, most blockchains do engage in.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic to see, one of the most important things that we can do in our role is give founders options, right?
Yes,
so really
right.
exciting. Yeah, so really exciting to see more options for founders looking to launch projects in the United States. It's also obviously really important, to recognize facts and circumstances of each individual project, right? So
that's right.
On that note, like some of the more mature projects are still looking for a way. If you've had a token out there for a while, you've got an existing, structure and framework to operate more in the United States, and so to that end. The SAY Foundation recently announced, and I recently joined the board of the SAY Development Foundation, a US-based, kind of 501c4. There's obviously, again, a lot of facts and circumstances that go into these choices. Do you think we're going to see more projects kind of try to operate in these like hybrid models? I'm sure you've been having conversations with, founders in your portfolio about similar decisions.
Yeah, look, I think what you guys are doing great. And I think it's directionally very consistent with where we see, some of the projects on our side going. I think you're absolutely right that we're likely to see an intermittent step here, right, where we're balancing these foreign foundations with more U.S. presence. And I think that that's totally fine. There's also a lot of complications in kind of companies that have moved outside the United States. How do we bring them back without punitive tax, obligations, things like that? So there's real problems that we have to deal with here, and there's no just single solution that's going to fit for everyone. But what I will say is, in my mind, right, the end state goal should be to what is going to help entrepreneurs innovate as quickly as possible, and I think that means lowering, right, the cost and the time that they have to spend on dealing with these structural issues. And so like in our ideal state, right, you would have systems where you have a DevCo and you have a DUNA that does token-based governance. If you want a foundation in the US, strap that on, sure, but you don't need it. You can still do airdrops, right? You can pay taxes. You can have legal existence in the United States. And if you get it down to that, right, setting up a DUNA very easy, formulaic, startup lawyers all across the country have forms that they can use. We think that you can rapidly accelerate the pace of innovation. Whereas currently, right now, we're in a situation, right, where, I'm sure you guys are aware, right? Projects are spending $500,000, engaging tax advisors and engaging Cayman Council and setting up these structures, and then paying exorbitant fees for directors to sit on these foundations in foreign territories. It's just not a system that is designed for, like rapid innovation and acceleration. And so we really kind of want to streamline it and basically position entrepreneurs to do as well as possible.
There's been conversations I've had throughout the years, and obviously they've changed, where these American founders are no longer in America because of the existing regulatory climate or quote unquote hostility towards founders in this space. And then I've also noticed that there's VCs, I'm not saying a16z, but ones that I've spoken to over the years who said, actually, we're not investing in American founders, even though we're an American venture capital firm. because it's just too risky right now. Do you see kind of a shift on that front where both these foundations and American founders are coming back to the US if they were American denominated? And then in the same vein, what are the conversations like with VCs when it comes to investing in American founders?
Yeah, so certainly every day I'm having a conversation with an entrepreneur that's asking either if they haven't launched a token yet, they're asking how do they do a US only structure? And so we're providing a lot of help there. We're also talking to entrepreneurs that are asking, hey, like I want to bring everything back. I want to streamline this process. It's too complicated having 5 people in this organization, 10 people in this one, 20 people in this one, right? How do we kind of make this work better? And that one's, that's a little bit more complicated because there are, various laws around kind of bringing assets back into the United States, but there are pathways that we're working on there as well. With respect to investments, I can't really speak to what, the focus of other VCs have been. I think our focus has always been predominantly in the United States, and that's continuing to be where we're focused.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's safe now for these American founders to launch tokens in the US then? I do. I think that as long as you are, for instance, but going back to the token taxonomy that we talked about, right? I think if you're launching company-backed tokens, I think that's pretty risky. If you're trying to sell these things to the general public, I think those still look like securities transactions. ICOs, in my view, still are subject to securities laws. At the same time, right, I think projects that are pursuing decentralization in good faith are going to be able to do so, and I hopefully build products that have are not lawyer designed but are actually consumer focused.
Yeah, Miles, I want to ask you guys about the initiatives that the firm has put together around America, and you guys were also very early to this, right? Like Mark Andreessen coming out, you guys hiring partners around this idea of American dynamism, building for industry. How does the work on crypto and this kind of initiative, enabling American innovation and founders fit together with these broader visions that you guys have around, rebuilding, I don't know if I would call it the industrial or defense base, but like really, really doubling down, to Jackie's point about the way, I guess, some other firms kind of have reacted here. Like how does that long-term vision all kind of play together for you guys?
Yeah, look, I think one of the unique things that we've done is we've crafted out a strategy, right, that is just really about our little tech agenda. And it's about empowering entrepreneurs across the United States, right, to build things. And I think that, if you look back over the course of the last 20 years, Silicon Valley hasn't gotten too involved with what was going on in DC, but I think we got to see really, starting with social media and the DC's approach to it, right? But really, crypto was gloves off, right? And it was very clear, right, that without kind of, representation in Washington and fighting for this technology, that the momentum was carrying us in a direction that would have led to, the banning of a technology, which is just insane. Like, you're just going to ban, people having computers? Like it leads to a place that is very, concerning. And so as a result of that, what we've really focused on across all of our verticals, right, is how do we, make sure that entrepreneurs are empowered with clear rules, right, to build. And we think that is the best thing for the United States, and that it's going to lead to a dynamic economy and continue to propel the United States to be at the forefront of the world.
Yeah, that goes exactly to my next question, Miles, which is you mentioned Silicon Valley having an outsized role in government now. I'm wondering how, as head of government policy, how those government agencies have been to interact with. I mean, going to Capitol Hill, talking to lawmakers, talking to regulators on behalf of a16z. How has that been going? And then I guess what's the ultimate goal there, aside from furthering digital assets?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our conversations are certainly, more constructive now than they were during the prior administration. I think both across crypto and AI, there was a lot of difficulty in getting traction. Either people were just totally disinterested in the subject, right, or were coming to it without, the desire to work constructively. Was really just kind of the end goal was, hey, let's either get rid of this or let's consolidate a power in the hands of a few people that we can regulate and control. And so that has completely shifted, right? People are now trying to figure out how do we make sure that America wins with respect to these technologies. And so there's much more openness to engage in dialogue. Now that doesn't mean, right, that you hand them something and they're like, sure, we're going to go ahead and go do that, right? But having the ability to have these constructive dialogues is super important. There's, tons of different actors that need to have their voices heard. And we're out there trying to represent the voices of our startups and push in the direction that gives them clear rules of the road. I think across, digital assets, across AI, we're really just about whatever kind of, policy measures that we think are going to effectively empower startups as opposed to entrenched interests is really the direction that we're going to go. And we, again, think that that's the best thing for America.
Yeah, so I want to follow up on that. A16Z opened an office, here in DC. I think I actually saw Gary Tan at the NED last week, and there's a lot of excitement, I think, about the openness and the conversations that that we're able to have right now, and I guess for historical, maybe more kind of libertarian reasons or leanings, like we do have a lot of allies, a lot more allies on one side of the aisle than the other. And I just want to know, like, this is obviously a long game for you guys. You've been doing this for a long time. We're very excited about the opportunities we have to work with legislators here right now. How do you kind of carry that through in like a nonpartisan way? Like, how do you kind of how do you continue that agenda forward, sort of regardless of who's in in the seat?
I think that defining an optimistic vision for these technologies is super important. And I think that we've been very effective at doing that within crypto. Chris Dixon's book, Read, Write, Own, I think provided a very compelling, vision of the world. Even my mom has read it. I'm not sure that she understood it, but I think that she at least has some sense now of what I'm working on. But
my mom has a copy, by the way.
I think that at the end of the day, I would say that, if you look across what's happening in DC, I think that crypto is the most bipartisan issue there is right now. And a lot of people want to frame this as a, very partisan subject. And, when you look at some of the grandstanding that happens in the, Senate or House hearings, right, you can feel a little bit of partisan tension. But at the end of the day, behind closed doors, when you're talking to these people, right, everyone that was supportive of this technology, prior to the last election is still supportive of it now. And I think the industry has done a very good job, right, at defining the optimistic vision for the technology and arguing for, really why we want clear rules of the road. That's another area where I think that, one of the most prevalent and frustrating misconceptions about the industry, right, is that it's asking for, just regulatory arbitrage. It wants no rules. And that's just not the case, right? I mean, I think we've spent enormous amounts of efforts all across the industry trying to push for clear, common sense regulation. Hopefully, we're going to get it soon. And I think once that happens, we'll be able to really focus on the good and get rid of the bad.
It's interesting you bring it up as nonpartisan. Our guests on the past have done the same, and I hope that it does go down that route. But I think it's also easy to compare like the crypto policy landscape from the prior administration to the current one and kind of the way the industry was treated, right? But maybe on a smaller scale, how has that environment changed since, let's say, November when Trump was reelected as president to January to where we are now? Are there different nuances and like weird little stories that you could kind of share that have shifted that maybe have surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I think in meetings with across both houses of Congress, I think that the conversations continue to be very productive. I think everyone is looking and understands. I think there's much greater recognition that we do need, clear rules of the road now. I would say that I think if you're paying attention though to the, Senate and House hearings, you can start to see that I think, there are some people, obviously the industry hasn't gotten rid of all of its enemies. And I think you can start to see that there are some in Congress, right, that want to, tie the industry to, the president or tie the industry to illicit finance and things like that. And I think I think that those attacks are going to fall on deaf ears. We've kind of heard it, from the Elizabeth Warrens of the world for a very long time now. And I think people are kind of like, nah, I think that there's actually something here. This is a technology. These are good entrepreneurs. Let's give them clear rules of the road and let's move forward.
I want to circle back quickly, Miles, to Brian Quintenz. I mentioned him in the beginning, but you've worked with him for several years at a16z. You know him quite well. What do you expect him to prioritize as head of the CFTC?
Boy, Brian was great to work with. I learned so much from him. I have total admiration for him. He's such a high integrity individual. I think that he's got an enormous challenge ahead of him, and I hope that he is, I hope that he is really kind of taking this time that he has right now to build up the willpower to kind of take on the challenge. I think if we get market structure legislation passed, right, there's going to be the rulemaking pace over the course of the next few years is going to be very intense. But I couldn't be more confident in a person leading the agency that I think is going to take an enormous role in this industry. So I'm thrilled for him, and I'm really looking forward to him bringing the energy and leadership that he has to that role.
Do you foresee, just a quick follow up, the CFTC getting bigger jurisdiction over the crypto regulatory landscape? Do you see the CFTC potentially having jurisdiction over spot markets for digital commodities?
Yeah, I do think that they will have spot market, authority over digital commodities, and so I think that's likely where we'll end up. Right now we're in a regulatory framework where the pathway out of securities laws leads to a totally unregulated market, and so things like Bitcoin, Ethereum that have crossed that decentralization threshold, really there's no one overseeing that market, and that does introduce risks because these assets can be traded in ways that ultimately harm consumers. And so as a result of that, I do think that we need spot market authority, but we just hope that we can get more clear rules about what jurisdiction individual digital assets are in, to make sure that it's very clear whether or not you're in the SEC zone, CFTC zone, and that's a very clear line that entrepreneurs can build towards.
Yeah, Miles, I think it's obviously really exciting to have, folks like Brian working, with this administration. We've harped on the show many times about the number of allies and even the number of guests we've been able to have. If Brian finds himself with any spare time in the coming weeks, to come on and talk to us about what we're trying to do as an industry here. I do want to ask, one of those alignments has been that we're going to get market structuring by August. That was the goal, kind of the gauntlet that was laid down. Are you optimistic? Do you think we'll get there? I mean, I know there's just so much going on in the world, but what do you think about our chances?
I'm very optimistic. I mean, I think that there's been a number of different things that are unprecedented in terms of setting us up for this opportunity, right? I mean, you had, Donald Trump in the White House with a bunch of, heads of industry there saying that he wants legislation done by August, right? You had, David Sachs and Bo Hines meeting with the heads of the, Senate Ag, Senate Banking, House Financial Services, and House Ag, right? All saying and dedicating that they were going to work towards this goal. So, I would hate for us to fumble this opportunity because we could not be in a better position to actually get real rules. And that doesn't mean, right, negating or just playing to one side of the aisle, right? I think that we want to bring as many people along as we saw done with, the CRA vote on the IRS broker rule, right? Broadly bipartisan. You just don't even see votes like that in DC anymore. And so I think that we have a real opportunity to get this done. It's really our opportunity to lose.
Yeah, I think one of the best quotes I heard was, "We could amend the Constitution with that kind of bipartisan support."
There you go. That's great.
Yeah.
Amazing. Last thing, Miles, to wrap things up, aside from everything that we've discussed in this episode, what is one other thing that you're watching in DC that you think others should listen and pay attention to?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the real takeaway for me at what's going on in this moment, right, is that we have an enormous opportunity, right? We have stablecoin legislation out there that could unlock, a new types of networks on top of old payment rails and completely revolutionize, right, how those systems work. At the same time, right, with market structure legislation, we have an opportunity to give entrepreneurs clear rules of the road, right? And preserve the benefits of this technology, which are that it creates decentralized, disintermediated, trustless, networks that people can build on top of. That opens up the door for more competition, safeguarding freedoms, right? More equitable participation in the internet. And as a result of that, I think that is what our, sole focus is at this moment, right? We want to get clear rules of the road. We want to bring more entrepreneurs into the space, and we want to unleash innovation in the United States.
100%. I think we all want that, Miles. Thank you so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, Miles.